The October 2025 JW broadcasting just dropped, and South Africa gets a spotlight once again. They tell the story of young white men in South Africa standing tall for their conscience, enduring imprisonment under the brutal apartheid regime. They were called the Blue Boys, Jehovah's Witnesses who refused to bear arms, wear military uniforms, or salute the flag. And in this official narrative, they are painted as heroes of faith, noble martyrs for neutrality. But this video testimony of white South African Jehovah's Witnesses who were imprisoned during apartheid presents a troubling narrative, one that celebrates institutional resilience while obscuring uncomfortable questions about organizational responsibility. While the courage of the individual Blue Boys who endured solitary confinement deserves acknowledgement, the broader story reveals a religious organization that placed young men in impossible positions, then retrospectively framed their suffering as spiritual triumph. The video portrays these imprisonments as noble stands for Christian neutrality, yet this framing conveniently ignores a critical historical reality. During one of the 20th century's most morally unambiguous conflicts, Jehovah's Witnesses' doctrine of strict political neutrality meant that members took no position on apartheid itself.
One blessing we all experience is our Christian meetings. They are essential. But for hundreds of young South African brothers in the 1970s and 1980s, this lifeline was taken away. Or was it? What risk did they take to fill their spiritual needs?
In the 1960s, South Africa started to become increasingly involved in military conflicts in neighboring countries. As a result, many of our young brothers were drafted for military service, but because of their neutrality, the brothers were sent to prison.
Initially, when the brothers were sentenced to military prison, they were required to wear the army uniform, which of course they refused to do.
The brothers felt that dressing in those clothes would identify them with the military prisoners, and they took a stand on that. They wore blue overalls and hence became known as the Blue Boys.
Everyone knew the Blue Boys were Jehovah's Witnesses.
In the early days, the brothers served their entire sentence locked up in individual cells, and that made it very difficult for them to be able to meet together for worship. One of the brothers who served during those days was David Carricus. Just recently, Dave and I got together and we talked about some of our experiences in prison.
When I got into prison, we were not allowed to communicate at all. We were strictly speaking in solitary confinement. Their aim was to break the witnesses. They said as much. There were 64 cells, 32 on each side, and we used to perch ourselves up on the bars above the door and made a little mini hammock, as it were. And when everything was locked up and quiet, then we would have the meetings. We had a whole spiritual program. We had a public talk, the theocratic ministry school, and we had to conduct the meeting just audibly enough to hear each other.
But first, a bit of history. Beginning on June the 7th, 1967, the apartheid South African government passed the Defence Amendment Bill, making it compulsory for all white males of eligible age to participate in the armed forces. Conscription brought Jehovah's Witnesses into conflict with the government, and young men who refused military service were sentenced to no less than 12 months at a military detention barracks, with repeat convictions in some cases. According to the Survey of Race Relations in South Africa of 1974, during 1973, 158 Jehovah's Witnesses were sentenced for refusing on religious grounds to render service or undergo training. In the first half of 74, 120 Jehovah's Witnesses were sentenced. Conscription was officially ended in late August 1993, and by this time the Constitution of South Africa had been adjusted to allow for alternative civilian service instead of military service. Now, while other religious bodies during the 70s and the 80s, including the South African Council of Churches, Desmond Tutu, Alan Busak, etc., publicly questioned whether defending white minority rule constituted a just war, Jehovah's Witnesses remained strategically silent on the moral dimensions of apartheid. Their objection wasn't to the injustice of the system, but to any military service whatsoever. And this allowed the organization to claim principal resistance while avoiding any meaningful challenge to systemic racism. And I made this video about a year and a half ago to explain in detail the untold story of those white Jehovah's Witnesses males who were imprisoned in South Africa during the apartheid era. Neutrality for them was never about peace or conscience. It was about obedience, not to the government, but to Warwick. The testimony reveals a disturbing pattern in how the Watchtower organization operates. Young men, often teenagers, fresh from high school, were given a binary choice: violate their religious convictions and face disfellowshipping, shunning by family and community, or go to prison. The organization provided no alternative path, no advocacy for legal reform, no effort to shield vulnerable young members from this fate. David Carrigus describes how the brothers who went to prison in the 10 years or so before had a big impact. They laid the track, as it were. It was only afterwards that alternative service was allowed.
The brothers who went to prison in the 10 years or so before I went in had a big impact. They laid the track, as it were. These brothers came out of prison with their faith strong, they had a joyful countenance, and that was really inspiring as younger brothers like myself were preparing for our time in prison. Things were a little different when I was in there. We were in the prison blocks, but on the weekends we were not locked up. They left us alone. And so we bring our chairs or upturned buckets and sit in groups, and we could have most of our meetings that way, including the songs. Some of the brothers had made their own musical instruments. So the army was used to the idea of us singing various songs, and so it didn't create as much attention.
Jehovah God is my shepherd, so why should I fear or fret?
Also, if we were careful enough on a weekend, we could bring in the materials for circuit assemblies and district conventions.
Wow.
And have our conventions. One of these pictures shows the brothers' costumes for dramas. We'd have those at 6 o'clock in the morning so that there was much less opportunity of being discovered. And the brothers loved that because they were able to really get into the spirit of the dramas. That especially we didn't want the corporals to see.
Amazing how Jehovah kept a flow of spiritual food even going in behind prison walls.
Yeah. Our meetings were very important, whether they were approved by the authorities or not. This is one thing we would not let go.
This reveals the institutional mechanism at work. Earlier prisoners became exemplars, their suffering transformed into propaganda that socialized the next generation to accept imprisonment as inevitable, even desirable. And the organization created a self-perpetuating cycle where each cohort of imprisoned young men normalized the expectation for those who followed. They go on to explain particular pride in the secret meetings held in prison, the makeshift conventions at 6 a.m., the smuggled spiritual materials, the memorial celebration grudgingly permitted by authorities. But consider what this actually demonstrates. The organization prioritized maintaining its meeting structure and theological content delivery over fighting for the actual liberation of these young men. Resources went toward preserving institutional practices rather than legal challenges, public advocacy, or seeking alternative service arrangements. The testimony presents the continued flow of spiritual food into prisons as evidence of organizational care. But this conflates institutional self-preservation with member welfare. The organization ensured its doctrines reached imprisoned members, not because this served the members' interests, but because maintaining ideological control was paramount. Compare this to what other conscientious objectors experienced. Peter Mole, a Baptist imprisoned around the same time, had backing from his individual clergy members who actively counseled objectors and advocated publicly for legal reform and alternative service. And these supporters didn't just send religious literature into prisons, they challenged the system itself, seeking to change laws and create better options for young men facing the draft. The Watchtower organization did none of this. Instead, it maintained its doctrine of strict neutrality, which precluded any engagement with political reform, even reforms that would directly benefit its own members. Young Jehovah's Witnesses were imprisoned in their hundreds, while their organization remained conspicuously absent from public debates about conscientious objection, alternative service, or the injustice of apartheid. The videos claim that meeting attendance has become a treasured gift, since prison reveals how the organization weaponizes trauma for institutional benefit. Young men subjected to solitary confinement and years of imprisonment emerged, understandably, with intensified attachment to the only community that affirmed their choices. But this wasn't organic spiritual growth. It was predictable psychology exploited for organizational loyalty. The leadership's authority structure made this inevitable. The governing body makes no provision for members to criticize or contribute to official teachings, and pronouncements carry almost as much weight as the Bible itself. Young men couldn't question whether their imprisonment truly served God's purposes, or whether the organization bore any responsibility for their suffering. They could only internalize the narrative that their sacrifice proved their faith. And most tellingly, the video makes no mention of young men who didn't endure prison faithfully. Those who broke under pressure, accepted military service, or left the organization altogether. What happened to them? Were they shunned, disfellowshipped, made examples of to warn others? The organization's historical pattern suggests many suffered this fate. The same autocratic structure that sent young men to prison would have treated those who faltered as apostates, cutting them off from family and community precisely when they most needed support. Yet these casualties don't appear in the triumphant narrative. The organization celebrates those who survived while erasing those who didn't, creating a sanitized history that obscures the full human cost of its policies. The fundamental question this testimony raises is one of organizational accountability. If you are a religious institution that mandates conscientious objection for your members, knowing this will result in imprisonment, what is your ethical obligation to those members? At minimum, it should include providing legal representation and advocacy, publicly championing their cause and seeking legal reforms, creating support systems for imprisoned members and their families, taking institutional responsibility for the consequences of your doctrines, or offering pathways for those who cannot endure imprisonment without destroying their lives. The Watchtower organization did virtually none of this. Instead, it documented the suffering for future propaganda, praised those who endured, and implicitly condemned those who didn't. The young men were expendable. The doctrine was eternal. The Blue Boys showed remarkable resilience in horrific circumstances. Many demonstrated genuine courage and conviction, but their individual bravery doesn't absolve the organization that systematically placed them in that position while claiming neutrality as a shield against moral responsibility. The Watchtower has a long record of glorifying imprisoned witnesses while providing minimal real-world support. During both World Wars, thousands of witnesses were jailed for refusing conscription, yet there were no legal defense funds, no trauma counseling, and no reintegration programs afterward. In South Africa, many of the Blue Boys returned from prison to find themselves ostracized by their communities and forgotten by the organization. Some struggled with their mental health issues and unemployment, problems the Watchtower dismissed as tests of faith. The society offered no compensation, no education assistance, no therapy, and no acknowledgement of the psychological harm caused by years of confinement. Their sacrifices were quickly repurposed into assembly videos and watchtower articles, framed as proof of Jehovah's blessing on his organization. Their suffering became a marketing tool. During apartheid, when choosing sides was unavoidable, Jehovah's Witnesses chose institutional survival. Their neutrality wasn't principled. It was convenient. It allowed them to avoid both supporting an evil regime and actively opposing it, while young men paid the price in years of imprisonment. What makes the Watchtower's narrative especially hypocritical is its theology of persecution. Jehovah's Witnesses are taught that persecution is evidence of divine approval. The more they suffer, the more it supposedly proves they are the true religion. And this circular logic conveniently absolves the organization of responsibility. If its members are imprisoned, it must be because Satan is attacking Jehovah's people. If they are shunned, isolated, or destroyed psychologically, it is simply a test of faith. Thus, even the organization's failures are reframed as triumphs.
Yeah, that really was.
The source of our strength was the spiritual food we had and the brotherly love that existed and the encouragement. So the brothers made every effort to keep the meetings going. And a good example of that was the memorial. When I got into prison, we were asking the authorities, please let us have the memorial. And the answer was a definite no. So we were ready to do it on our own, but we kept asking. And eventually on the Memorial Day, that Tuesday afternoon, suddenly they let us all out of our cells, let us go and shower. We weren't allowed to use the showers normally. And they said, get dressed for your service tonight.
Really?
And about 7 o'clock, we had the memorial in the little chapel there. When we started singing the song in that little chapel, about 125 of us, the volume was deafening. And there was hardly a dry eye in the audience. After the memorial, we got out. I still remember the full moon rising in the east there over the military headquarters of South Africa. And it was like a victory. If it's Jehovah's will for us to have the memorial, nobody's going to stop it. But it was the most memorable memorial of my life.
I can just imagine. Meeting together in prison as we did made me realize that the privilege of meeting together is not our gift to Jehovah as much as his gift to us.
Yes,
And it really binds you together in a
Yes.
very special way.
it does. We really need the meetings. We need that spiritual strength.
Meeting attendance, I think especially since that time, has become a treasured gift. We don't easily want to miss our meetings, and certainly to be there in person if we can.
Hearing other brothers express their faith and giving you an opportunity to express your faith is a great source of encouragement, vital source.
It's not just a group of people who are learning the same thing. This is a spiritual family, and Jehovah knows that we need to draw together and encourage one another personally, particularly, as Paul said, as the day draws near.
Let's take Brother Martin's advice and fully embrace our Christian meetings. They really do encourage us as the day draws near. But meetings do even more. They prepare us for persecution by elevating our thinking to agree with God's. If the thought of persecution makes you anxious, rest assured you can stay faithful. You'll have Jehovah's Holy Spirit and loving care.
When the video said, if it's Jehovah's will for us to have the memorial, nobody's going to stop it, it reflects this same fatalism. The event is presented as a miracle, not as the result of bureaucratic permission or negotiation, but as divine intervention. The line between faith and indoctrination becomes blurred beyond recognition. What's missing is any acknowledgement of agency, choice, or responsibility. The Jehovah's Witness organization has long thrived on persecution narratives. From Nazi Germany to Malawi, from Russia to Rwanda, every instance of government opposition becomes a PR opportunity. The message is always the same. We are the only true religion because we are persecuted. But persecution does not prove truth. It only proves conflict. In South Africa, as in other countries, Jehovah's Witnesses' suffering was not simply inflicted by external forces. It was compounded by internal dogmatism. The organization created martyrs out of young men who might otherwise have lived peaceful, productive lives. Then it claimed credit for their endurance. Where are the voices of those who broke down in solitary confinement? Where are the letters from parents who begged the organization to help with legal challenges and for their sons to come home? There were. Where are the stories of the men who never fully recovered from the trauma? They don't appear in Watchtower videos because they contradict the narrative. They reveal that faith in the organization often leads to devastation, not salvation. And perhaps most damning of all, these men's imprisonment changed nothing. The Watchtower did not grow more compassionate, more transparent, or more just as a result of their sacrifice. It only grew more self-assured. The Watchtower's telling of the Blue Boys' story is not an act of remembrance. It is an act of manipulation. It exploits genuine human suffering to reinforce obedience, recasting trauma as triumph and coercion as courage. Yes, these young men endured unspeakable hardship. Yes, they showed courage in the face of oppression. But their suffering was compounded by the very organization that now celebrates them. They were taught to believe they were serving God, but in truth, they were serving a corporation, one that has never hesitated to sacrifice individuals for the sake of its public image. Their courage was real. Their pain was real. But the Watchtower's moral authority was not. Behind every kingdom melody sung in those prison cells was the echo of betrayal, a reminder that the men who claimed to speak for God were, in the end, no better than the system they claimed to oppose.